My sister took my $30K loan, then left me to pay her debt. I was 25 when my sister convinced me to co-sign a loan for her startup idea. She had this whole presentation ready, complete with charts and projections she'd made on her laptop. The passion in her eyes when she talked about her online boutique made me believe this was different from her previous failed ventures. She needed $30,000 to get started, and her credit wasn't good enough to qualify a loan. The bank meeting went smoothly. She wore her best dress, spoke confidently about market research and target demographics. I sat there feeling proud of my little sister for once taking something seriously. The loan officer seemed impressed by her business plan, and with my steady income as collateral, we walked out with the approved paperwork. She hugged me tight in the parking lot, promising this would change everything for our family. For the first few months, everything seemed legitimate. She'd send me photos of inventory arriving at her apartment, racks of clothes she'd purchased from wholesalers. Her social media accounts showed professional-looking product shots and customer testimonials. When I asked about sales figures, she always had encouraging numbers ready. The monthly payments were manageable on my salary, and seeing her finally focused on something gave me hope. But then the calls started coming in from suppliers demanding payment. Apparently, she'd been ordering inventory on credit terms she couldn't meet. When I confronted her about it, she broke down crying, explaining how competitive the online market was and how she'd underestimated the costs. She promised to figure it out, said she just needed more time to build the customer base. I wanted to believe her desperation was genuine. The breaking point came when I discovered she'd been living a completely different life than she'd led me to believe. A mutual friend casually mentioned seeing her at expensive restaurants and clubs, always dressed in designer clothes I'd never seen before. When I checked her Instagram more carefully, I noticed she'd been posting from vacation spots and luxury hotels. The timestamps showed these trips happened during the same weeks. She claimed to be working 18-hour days on her business. I drove to her apartment unannounced one evening, finding it filled with shopping bags from high-end stores. Designer shoes were scattered across the living room floor, and her closet was bursting with clothes that still had tags attached. When I asked where all this came from, she became defensive, claiming she needed to look successful to attract customers. But the math didn't add up, and we both knew it. That night, I stayed up researching her supposed business online. The website looked professional enough, but there were no real customer reviews outside of her own social media posts. The inventory photos were stock images I found on wholesale websites. Even worse, the business registration she'd shown me was fake. I couldn't find any official records of her company existing. She'd built an elaborate fiction to justify spending $30,000 on herself. The next morning, I demanded she come clean about everything. She finally admitted the business had never been real, that she'd used the loan money to fund a lifestyle she couldn't afford. She said she'd been depressed about her life and thought living like a successful person would make her feel better. The confession felt hollow, like she was only sorry about getting caught rather than the betrayal itself. I gave her an ultimatum. Either she'd get a job and start making the monthly payments, or I'd have to take legal action. She agreed initially, even applied to a few places and went on some interviews. But within weeks, she was back to her old patterns, sleeping until noon and making excuses about why she couldn't find suitable work. The loan payments kept coming out of my account while she contributed nothing. Things got worse when she started dating someone new, a guy who seemed to have money based on the places they'd go and things they'd do. She'd post photos from expensive dinners and weekend trips, all while claiming she was still job hunting. When I confronted her about this contradiction, she said he was paying for everything and that she deserved to be happy. The selfishness of that statement hit me harder than I expected. The relationship with this guy gave her a new excuse to avoid responsibility. She claimed he was going to help her pay back the loan, that he understood her situation and wanted to support her. I never met him, but from what I could gather through social media, he seemed like someone who enjoyed showing off his wealth. I suspected she hadn't told him the truth about her financial situation. 6 months after the loan was approved, she disappeared completely. Her apartment was empty when I went to check on her, with no forwarding address left behind. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and all her social media accounts were deactivated. Even our parents hadn't heard from her, though they seemed less surprised by this development than I was. They'd been dealing with her irresponsible behavior much longer than I had. I spent weeks trying to track her down, calling mutual friends and even hiring a private investigator. The few leads I got suggested she'd moved to another state, possibly living with the guy she'd been dating. But without concrete information, there was nothing I could do legally to force her to return or take responsibility for the debt she'd created. The bank made it clear that as the cosigner, I was fully responsible for the loan regardless of her disappearance. They showed no sympathy for my situation, treating it as a straightforward business matter. The monthly payments continued to drain my savings, and I realized I'd be dealing with this financial burden for years to come. My credit would be ruined if I defaulted, so I had no choice but to keep paying. I had to make significant changes to my lifestyle to accommodate the extra expense. I moved to a smaller apartment, sold my car and started taking public transportation, and cut out most social activities that cost money. Friends noticed the changes, and I felt embarrassed explaining why I was suddenly so financially constrained. The shame of being taken advantage of by my own sister felt worse than the financial impact. My parents' reaction was the most frustrating part of the whole situation. They kept making excuses for her behavior, suggesting she must be going through a difficult time and that I should be more understanding. When I pointed out that I was the one suffering the consequences of her choices, they accused me of being too harsh and unforgiving. Their inability to see her actions clearly made me feel even more isolated. The stress began affecting my work performance, as I found myself constantly distracted by anger and resentment. I'd check her old social media accounts obsessively, looking for any sign of her current location or activities. Sleep became difficult as I'd lie awake calculating how much money I'd lost and how long it would take to recover financially. A year passed with no contact from her until she suddenly called me from an unknown number. Her voice sounded different, more mature somehow, and she claimed to be in a treatment program working on her issues. She apologized for everything and promised to start making payments once she completed the program. But her words felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced this conversation multiple times. She explained that she'd been staying with her boyfriend's family in another state, but that relationship had ended badly. She was now living in a halfway house and working part-time at a retail store. The details seemed designed to make me feel sorry for her rather than address the real issue of the debt she'd left me with. I wanted to believe her promises, but I'd heard similar commitments before. Over the following months, she sent me small amounts of money irregularly, $20 here, $50 there. While I appreciated any contribution, it was nowhere near enough to cover the monthly loan payments. It felt more like she was trying to ease her conscience than actually solve the problem she'd created. The gesture seemed hollow given the magnitude of what she'd done. The final betrayal came when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd been posting on new social media accounts under a different name. The photos showed her at parties and events, looking happy and carefree while I was still struggling to pay off her debt. She'd apparently found a new group of friends who didn't know about her past behavior, allowing her to reinvent herself completely. When I confronted her about this latest deception, she became angry and defensive, claiming I was stalking her online and that she had a right to privacy. She said she was trying to move on with her life, and that constantly dwelling on the past wasn't helping anyone. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me, and I haven't heard from her since. I realized that continuing to hope for her to change was only prolonging my own suffering. The loan would be paid off eventually, with or without her help, and I needed to focus on rebuilding my financial stability. I started working overtime whenever possible and picked up freelance projects to generate extra income. The additional work was exhausting, but it gave me a sense of control over my situation. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust and family dynamics that I hadn't understood before. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean enabling their destructive behavior, and that sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the deepest betrayals. Setting boundaries became a crucial skill I'd never developed properly. I also discovered strength I didn't know I possessed. Managing the financial burden alone while dealing with the emotional impact of her betrayal forced me to become more self-reliant and resilient. While I wouldn't choose to go through this experience again, it ultimately made me a stronger and more cautious person. The relationship with my parents remained strained, as they continued to make excuses for her behavior and pressure me to forgive and forget. They seemed to believe that family should stick together regardless of the circumstances, but I couldn't pretend that what she'd done was acceptable. The divide this created in our family was another casualty of her selfish choices. 2 years after she disappeared, I received a letter from a law firm indicating that she'd filed for bankruptcy in another state. The timing seemed convenient, as it would eliminate any legal obligation she might have had to repay the loan. It felt like a final slap in the face, a legal maneuver designed to ensure she'd never have to face the consequences of her actions. The bankruptcy filing also revealed that I wasn't her only victim. Court documents showed she'd accumulated significant debts with credit cards, other loans, and even unpaid rent from multiple apartments. The pattern of behavior was much more extensive than I'd realized, suggesting this was a long-term lifestyle rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. I considered challenging the bankruptcy or pursuing other legal remedies, but the cost and complexity of interstate litigation seemed prohibitive. My lawyer explained that even if I won, collecting money from someone with no assets would be nearly impossible. The legal system seemed designed to protect people like her, while leaving victims like me with limited recourse. The final loan payment was scheduled for next month, marking the end of a 3-year nightmare I never could have imagined. While I was relieved to finally be free of this financial burden, I felt no sense of closure or justice. She'd managed to escape all responsibility, while I'd paid the full price for her deception and selfishness. Looking back, I recognized the warning signs I should have noticed earlier. Her history of failed projects, her tendency to blame others for her problems, and her pattern of making grand promises she couldn't keep. But the desire to believe in family and hope for the best had blinded me to the reality of who she really was. The experience fundamentally changed how I approach relationships and financial decisions. I'll never co-sign another loan for anyone, regardless of our relationship or their promises. Trust, once broken so completely, becomes nearly impossible to rebuild. I've learned to protect myself from people who see kindness as weakness to be exploited. Despite everything, I sometimes wonder what happened to her and whether she ever thinks about the damage she caused. Part of me hopes she found a way to change and become a better person, while another part of me believes she's probably moved on to victimize someone else. The uncertainty is frustrating, but I've accepted that I may never know the truth. The financial recovery has been slow but steady. I've rebuilt my emergency fund and improved my credit score back to where it was before this ordeal began. More importantly, I've learned to value my own financial security over the approval or happiness of others. The lesson was expensive, but it may have saved me from even greater losses in the future. My sister taught me that family bonds don't guarantee loyalty or integrity, and that sometimes the people we love most are capable of causing us the greatest harm. While this knowledge is painful, it's also liberating in a way. I no longer feel obligated to sacrifice my well-being for someone who wouldn't do the same for me. The story ends with me stronger but sadder, financially stable but emotionally scarred. I paid off her debt, but I'll never get back the trust, money, or peace of mind she took from me. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive, and some relationships are too damaged to repair. Sometimes the only victory is surviving and moving forward without looking back.